I think we've counted to 20.
Yes, I think so.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Think Fest session between me and Victoria Schofield. This is about a book that she's just written, a memoir, she calls it, of friendship. And I've read it from cover to cover, and I'm fascinated by it because Benazir Bhutto was indeed a very fascinating person. Of course, Victoria and she were very good friends. And in later times, I was also a good friend to her, and she to me. And so we all shared a lot of memories. But before that, let me introduce Victoria to you. I'm sure most of you know her very well and have read her books. She's a prolific author. Whether she intended that to be the case, I'm not sure. Certainly ask her. I suspect that her days at Oxford and then with Benazir had something to do with her becoming a journalist and then becoming an author and so on. But she's an expert on South Asia. She's written on Pakistan. She's written on Kashmir. She's written on India. She's interviewed people across the subcontinent. She's also written biographies. Lord Wavell, I think that too. I don't know where that came from. And but amongst other things, travelogues, Northwest Frontier, Central Asia, whatnot. I mean, there's no end to the depth of her reporting and her intellect. And so really, it's a great honor to be on this panel with you, Victoria. The last time we met was in London some 6 months ago, just before the time of Corona, when Arundhati Roy was there, and we exchanged pleasantries and hello highs. Do you remember that?
Indeed, I do. Yes, I think it was more than a year, alas. So we've had a year of lockdown.
That's true. Time flies.
So
So this book, the first question, obviously, that comes to mind is where's the title from?
The title. Well, Assalamualaikum everybody in Pakistan, and it's wonderful to be talking in conversation with you, Najam. We're old friends. We go back many decades. I wanted, in terms of the title, I've thought long and hard, obviously, about writing this book, this memoir. A lot of people approached me after Benazir's assassination, saying, "Oh, you should write, etc., etc." But to me, as I've actually put in the book, it was too raw. What I had to describe was too painful, and so I set it aside and got on with other work. But instead of it just being something rather generic, well, I mean, I had to have the subtitle, My Friendship with Benazir Bhutto. I wanted something really beautiful and poetic. And I came across this quotation in a poem from Shah Abdul Latif. And actually, it was Benazir who first introduced me to the poetry of Shah Abdul Latif. As you can imagine, I was an Oxford graduate, really having no knowledge at all of South Asia, its culture, its poetry. And back in my early days in Pakistan, there was another couplet she quoted of Shah Abdul Latif. And ever since then, I've looked out for his poetry and read the translations in English. And I thought this was a particularly beautiful title because, to describe what I, consider is, as I say, the beauty and the poetry of the culture. And I can read the whole quotation, which actually comes at the end of the book, when I make my first visit to her mazar, to the grave, which I very much want to do on one of my visits back to Pakistan. And it goes as follows. Having been to the mazar, I end the book with thinking back of my first visit to Gari Kudabaksh, which is the small village where the mazar is, when I'd first gone there over 30 years ago, and I'd been standing side by side with Benazir. But now she lay with her ancestors. At the time we said prayers for her ancestors, and the triumphs and tragedies of the future were unknown. And literally the last paragraph of the book is the poem. The sorrowful smell of the mist lingering over the Indus, gentle waves of rice, dung and rind. 'Tis the salt cry of Sind. As I die, let me feel the fragrance of tears. And Benazir always talked about going back to her homeland, that she would be buried with her ancestors in the heart of Sind. And that was why I chose that title, The Fragrance of Tears.
Well, Your book begins with your salad days in Oxford, when I think it was what 1974 till 1977,
Yeah.
when the two of you were together in Oxford after she'd come back from Harvard, and she then inched her way up to the presidency of the Oxford Union, and you along with her, and you then succeeded her, I think, as the
Yes.
president of the Oxford Union. So that's where the friendship was originally forged, wasn't it?
It was. In fact, I met her actually within a very few days myself of arriving at Oxford. It's one of those extraordinary things that, we meet people in life and we know people, but we don't remember exactly when we met them. But with Benazir, I can still, in my mind's eye, remember that very first meeting when I was introduced to her, and greeted by that wonderful smile that she had. And what actually initially brought us together was that we were in the same college, Lady Margaret Hall at Oxford. And what's relevant about Lady Margaret Hall in the present day for the next generation, of course, is that it's the college that Malala chose to go to precisely because Benazir had been to LMH, as we called it. And it was that lovely sort of enthusiasm which she had when she greeted so many friends. Oh, you're in my college. You must, we must get together. You must come and have tea. And so it was the college atmosphere. But then because I'd actually met her in the Oxford Union, I was deciding whether or not to join, that we then became very good friends because, again, we're talking about 1970s. It was a very different world. There were very few women who were taking part in Oxford Union politics, especially standing on for the committees and standing for office. And I think that's really what forged our friendship. We would pass notes to each other about sort of other people, rather rude sometimes, whether their speech was boring or we thought it was interesting, or things like, just things that undergraduates do, that they're having fun. And she actually was very encouraging. And I stood for office. She stood for office. She was 1 year ahead of me because she'd come from Harvard in 1973. I'd gone up to Oxford in 1974. So she, in a way, was I would say, trailblazing. But then the way that the elections worked out, it did so happen that I followed her in terms of standing for the office of president. She stood, and then I stood after her. And it's extraordinary to think now, because to be honest, women presidents of the Oxford Union are rather to a penny now. But in those days, there'd only been two before us. And she was the third and I was the fourth. And they'd never had a woman follow another woman. And I suppose, if I'm going to go straight into Benazir's personality, to me, this illustrated her enormous magnanimity, because you might have thought, as I think I've put in the book, that somebody else would think, oh, well, I want to have been the last woman president for a while. But not a bit of it. She immediately encouraged me. I was standing against three other men, in fact. But she immediately said, no, you must try, etc., etc. And that, to me, always typified Benazir. She was always excited by other people's successes. And maybe people don't know this about her, but to me, it was a characteristic I thought throughout her life. And I saw it in Pakistani politics as well, that she would, she'd encourage other women to become, to stand for the prescribed seats in the National Assembly, or to get on with their journalism, or to write books, or to do anything. She was always very excited by other people's success. And to me, that started with how we operated together in the Oxford Union. And it did form a very strong bond, I have to say. Subsequently, we both went down in 1977, and then we begin on my chapter 2, because those lovely salad days, the fun we had, were brought to, as I say, you couldn't have been more different the subsequent years that followed after 1977.
So how was Benazir's tenure as the president of the union different from others? You say that she brought in some very interesting radical changes.
Well, she was great fun. I mean, again, I think this is interesting. And, she had so little experience, actually, when she became prime minister. She hadn't been in government before. But so in a way, one might say this was a sort of experience of running something. And she ran the Oxford Union. But what was rather fun about her, and again, thinking back, sort of men in suits and all the rest of it, she cut a very dashing, exciting figure. What was interesting about her, actually, was that we have the sort of British class system, but you couldn't, in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, but because she was foreign, she was sort of different. She managed to bridge both, she didn't detect whether somebody had been to public school or somebody had been to private school, she crossed both those boundaries. She had a huge amount of friends from all types, all societies, all education. But she, instead of just sitting there for a term doing nothing, she wanted to sort of do something different. And it's true to say that people were always talking about reform of the Oxford Union and what should be done and livening it up a little bit. So from this
painting it blue.
I'm sorry?
Painting it blue.
Painting blue, yes. So her first innovation was to paint the president's office powder blue. I mean, it was very funny, and she drafted in a whole army of supporters because actually painting an office may not sound very arduous, but it is when there are numerous bookshelves, and all the books had to come out, and all the shelves had to be painted, and it was quite. I think it took place over the Christmas holidays. I mean, again, it shows how people they were prepared to spend their Christmas holidays painting the president's office blue. But more importantly, with the debates she held, she wanted to be a bit upbeat and introduce, as I say, not so much a radical change, but she wanted debate to be debate, not just a foregone conclusion. And it's true at that time that the sort of the conservative element of Oxford life, interestingly, in the early 70s, compared with how it had been in the late 60s, was tending towards conservatism. And so her first debate, she decided to invite Tariq Ali. Now, of course, Tariq Ali is very well known to you in Pakistan, but he was also very well known to us in the UK because of his support of international Marxism and all sorts of radical sort of movements that were going on at that time. And so I think
he'd also been president of the Union earlier.
And he'd been president of the Union. He'd been not, I think, the first Pakistan. He might have been the first Pakistan. I'd have to check that. He was the first Pakistani president. There'd been an Indian president some decades ago, but he was the first Pakistani president in the 60s. And so there was that affinity and that bond, but he absolutely captured the House. The motion was, I think, that capitalism will triumph, which he opposed.
Of course.
Right. And the atmosphere was electric. And that was her first debate because the House was packed and there was no fire regulations in those days. So people just piled in. She then introduced rock music into the debating chamber, which we'd never had before. And she just cut a very lively figure. As you all know, her interpersonal skills were very good. And so, she would invite people, and it was, as I say, it really was our salad days. Her other more innovative, but slightly more laborious reform was that Oxford Union was always short of money. In fact, it's still short of money. And she wanted to work out whether the library could be overhauled because it had subscriptions to an enormous number of magazines. So questionnaires had to be sent out to all members to say who used what book and what magazine and whether there could be cuts made. So it wasn't just all froth. There was some genuine activity which went on. I must admit, I was the librarian at the time. I had to carry out the questionnaires, but we had a lot of fun. It was, being involved in the Oxford Union and actually being president of the Oxford Union. We were invited to tea with Margaret Thatcher. We went to see Harold Macmillan, who was the Chancellor at the time, and to us as Super Mac, he was an old man, we thought, but nonetheless he had a pedigree and a history, so that was very exciting. You doors opened when you were involved with the Oxford Union that might not necessarily do otherwise. And she certainly made full advantage of it. And she enjoyed it. She had fun, which, in retrospect, I'm so glad she did, because actually I think it was probably her last real year of what I would say fun.
Yeah, I think there was a debate on this house would rather rock than roll.
That was when she had the rock music.
And then there was this one about this house likes dominating women.
That was her final debate. You
That
always
was her
have a
last
final
debate,
debate.
yes.
And
Yes.
it was, yes, and I think I've put in the book that it was meant to be that, sort of double meaning. But I think on reflection, we never, one didn't know how her life would be, how dominating as a personality she would be, how charismatic Yet at the same time, going into politics in Pakistan, her role as a woman would both be an example and also be something that she had to counter in terms of, the very traditional society which exists in Pakistan. So it was, who would have known that she just chose that as rather fun? It was meant to be a sort of fun debate, and it was a fun debate. But then she had also, again, in view of what happened to her father, she had one on capital punishment, a debate, and then on industrial democracy. So there was serious intent as well, which is what it's supposed to be with the debates. And what I would like to say at this juncture where we are in 2021, the Oxford Union's strength was that you had to debate and listen to either side of the motion, as it were. And as an undergraduate, you had also to hone your thought process and your debating skills to debate on a topic you may not necessarily agree with, but you had to then find the counter argument. It was what the undergraduates were supposed to be doing. You couldn't say, no, sorry, I don't want to debate on this. Obviously, the guest speakers, they could speak according to what their beliefs were, but the undergraduates were supposed to be able to fashion an argument either for or against. And another debate she actually was before she was president, she spoke in, was that this House would impeach President Nixon, literally just shortly before his impeachment. And I think she did speak in favor of that. But of course, her family had just, and her father as prime minister had just been received shortly before by President Nixon. And, they knew them personally. So, but as I say, you had to stand up to the table. And I think she herself said that she found her experience at the Oxford Union of thinking on her feet and also just in terms of management, something that stood her in good stead, as did the Oxford system of working on for exams in her later life when she was under such pressure.
How you write that her father was in touch with her, although there weren't any mobile phones and stuff like that, but still he was writing to her and encouraging her all the time. And she was looking to Papa for all manner of advice and so on. But you also say that at that time, she had no intention of going to politics in Pakistan. She wanted to join the Foreign Service.
Absolutely. That is true. And, there has been a tendency with her to look, with the wisdom of hindsight on her career trajectory. But as a historian myself, I know that we have to often divorce ourselves of what we know now and look back to sort of primary sources. And I remember before she went down, and I've actually still got the newspaper cutting where she was interviewed by a journalist. A journalist came from London to interview her on her future. And absolutely, she said she did not want to go into politics. She wanted to join, and she was going to join Pakistan's diplomatic service. She did a special course at Oxford to prepare herself for that. But as we know, events took over. And I think one of the most telling statements about Benazir's life is that she writes, I think, at the beginning of her updated autobiography, "I did not choose this life; it chose me." And I think that's very true.
You also write later in the book, and I quote you. You say, "I wish we had turned our minds more to the real world when we were together at Oxford, rather than the various problems of Oxford life." Yeah. So, what made you come to that conclusion?
I think that was a letter I wrote to her. When her father had been, by that time, overthrown by General Zia-ul-Haq in the military coup in July 1977, he'd been put on trial for conspiracy to murder. And I was, again, as you rightly say, writing old-fashioned letters. And I used to write to her. I never quite knew if the letters would get there, but they seemed to get through, with a bit of distance of time. And it was then, I think, we were all growing up. We were up in the big world. And it was a reflection that I had. And I'm very lucky as a journalist that, it was in the days of typewriters when you used to keep carbon copies of letters. And when I wanted to write this memoir, the younger generation would think it's completely bizarre. Of course, they have the copies of the emails they've sent. But we used to keep carbon copies, and I had a whole pile in a box upstairs in my home, and I went to look through, and that's why I quoted that particular letter. I was able to quote it because I kept, miraculously not knowing what purpose it would be used for, but I'd kept that carbon copy. But it was a moment of reflection that we'd been, I wouldn't say we'd been frivolous. We'd been enjoying ourselves as students should, but we didn't really concern ourselves with major events. I mean, occasionally they popped into our subconscious or our consciousness, but it was not topmost of our list of discussions. We were discussing our essays and our crises and, different personalities that we knew.
But of course, you write later in your book that while Bhutto Saab was incarcerated, she sought every opportunity to meet her father. And you say that these meetings with him were helping to forge her political character, both in terms of resilience in adversity and her understanding of her father's political vision. I mean, to what extent is that true? Because a father's political vision of socialism was not exactly her vision of socialism, was it?
Well, I think initially, what I would say, because we're going back to during that year, she was 24, 25. That was literally the year of the, so to speak, political tutelage. I think what he was passing on was his political vision message. And the essence of the message was for the people of Pakistan. And although the policies that were then enacted later, because, policies do change, and the sort of socialism no longer was fashionable in the way that it was in the 70s. I mean, you think of what was going on in the world. I mean, in the UK, etc. There was this turn back to more conservatism, but nonetheless, she did retain the vision of being able to improve life for the poorer people in Pakistan. And to her dying day, it was one of the last things she said before she got on board that aeroplane. I mean, we're fast forwarding, of course, but we all know the ultimate outcome of her life. But when she went back in October and there was the first assassination attempt, and we met up in Dubai, and it was one of the things she said, I'm going back because I really want to leave. I want to make a difference. I want to leave a legacy. And so I think, one mustn't sort of, as I say, what I wrote then was true. It was valid, but for that moment in time. But then she built upon it in her own direction and in her own fashion, according to how, circumstances had changed.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. We'll come to that, when the third time she's seeking a prime ministership. She's a very different woman from the earlier two times. I mean, I will give you my impressions of her. But going back a little bit, your experience during that time, you were there for about 11 months during your first trip. You charmed the editor of The Spectator into giving you a letter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I went.
And then, isn't that true? And then, you were part journalist, part friend, depending on what the circumstances required.
Well, yes. I mean, it was sort of trial by ordeal in a way. I was very unprepared, actually. And part of the sort of the narrative of the book is my own growing up as a Westerner, discovering Pakistan. And I say this, representing the West's ignorance of culture and customs. And, I've written it for the next generation, because we had none of the props or facilities that we've got now when we travel. There was no sort of handbook of customs and, no real awareness. And I think it's true to say we're talking about pre the Iranian Revolution. And I don't think the Western world, I mean, if we talk about the US, the UK and, European countries, woke up to culture in a way that they did subsequent to the Iranian Revolution. But it was because of my friendship. And this is where, again, I think it's important. And I also feel for younger generations, and I hope we're not moving away from getting these very strong cross-cultural friendships, that we don't all retreat back into our little sort of comfortable areas of what we feel, what we know. That because of that very strong friendship, I sallied forth with my camera, Instamatic camera, and my notebook to become a journalist, to be able to be in Pakistan, in order to give her what I thought my primary objective was, giving her moral support. And it was sort of the best way I could get in was as a journalist, because I wanted to be able to attend her father's appeal against the death sentence. By this stage, we were in May 1978. He'd been condemned to death. And so it was the best way to do it. And you're absolutely right. I did manage to get this extraordinary letter, which I'm sure the Spectator wouldn't do this now for any unknown, unpublished journalist. They gave me a letter of accreditation, which enabled me to get my pass to the Supreme Court. And I did sort of write several articles. I wrote my first articles on the appeal. But at the same time, I was there really to help Benazir. But it was true that things became more dramatic than they might have done, because actually when I arrived, she was already under house arrest. I'd never met anybody under house arrest. It was an expression entirely unfamiliar to me, to be under house arrest. I didn't know what it involved. She was released soon afterwards for a brief period, but most of the time I was there, she was under house arrest. And so we used to again communicate, but I got to know her lawyers. And I suppose one of the key components of my life there was that I'd actually learned to type. And I know this sounds extraordinary for the younger generation, because everybody types on laptops, but we're talking about old-fashioned typewriters, where learning to type was sort of an attribute, that if you could type fast. And I used to help her with documents that she wanted typed. Particularly, I typed a lot of Zulfikar Bhutto's writings from jail because I was quite fast. I'd thought learning to type. My father was a retired naval officer, and he used to type, and my mother used to type. So I thought it was fun. And I remember aged 11, I'd learned to type. So these were sort of, I mean, they're very sort of domestic details, but they explain why I was doing what I was doing at that time, and why I was sort of useful in a way, because I was trustworthy. I wasn't part of sort of the system. And that's what I spent a lot of time doing to help her as the events proceeded along the path, which, as we all now know what happened. The appeal was not upheld, and on a split verdict, Zulfikar Bhutto was hanged on 4th of April 1979, and that was sort of the end of the road in a way for me. And I came back to the UK soon afterwards.
Mr. Bhutto's thoughts and ideas that were subsequently published in India under the title of If I Am Assassinated. You write that, that was like 60,000 or 90,000 words, which he smuggled out of his prison and in scraps of paper. And then you ended up having to type out the whole thing, send it back to him for his approval in one way or the other. And then eventually it became what we've read as If I'm Assassinated.
Mm. That's right. Well, that was the big one of the big things that I did type for her, because again, actually, I mean, it's all now so long ago, but he was not permitted to write anything that was not relevant to the case. And it was during that time that General Zia had produced several white papers on his period in office between 71 and 77. And this was essentially, we used to call it the rejoinder. It was a rebuttal to the white paper, which he maintained the fact that the white paper had been produced while his appeal was being heard was prejudicial to the case, because it was prejudicing the minds of everybody at that time. And so that's why, many people now say in hindsight, why did he not just smuggle out his autobiography? But he was a stickler for doing what he was supposed to be doing. I mean, the lawyers, as I say, smuggled out is probably, the lawyers brought the paper out, and technically he was allowed to write it because it was rebutting the white paper. But why, when you read it, it's sort of got paragraphs which, if, it's not, I would say it's not the easiest read. But he did digress into discussing all sorts of things on his tenure of office, which he wanted to be recorded for posterity. And it was actually a very long and arduous work to be doing, because he was doing it all by hand. It was boiling hot, and I had never experienced such heat before. We were doing it in August, July, August, in Pakistan, as you know, a couple of the hottest months there are. And he was doing it from memory. He didn't have the books, to refer to. But it was, again, I suppose one would say it had its benefits, because it kept him very busy and very active. And it kept us very busy too. I mean, Benazir was also, working on it and looking at it, and we were checking things. And I remember, I think I put it in the book, one time when he'd finished it, he said, with two ex-presidents of the Union helping me, how can I fail, kind of thing. There were these sort of endearing comments that used to come through on the notes. But it did then subsequently get, as you say, published. It was one of the phrases that he had used, "if I'm assassinated." And so the Indian publishers chose to use this as the title. And it's best known as "If I'm Assassinated." But we knew it as the rejoinder because it was the rejoinder to the white paper.
Yeah. During the trial, you were sitting in the Supreme Court, the appeal, and you sketched the judges. You also sketched Mr. Bhutto. I think that's the last sketch of Mr. Bhutto. I don't know if you have it here in front of you. Perhaps you could show us that sketch of Mr. Bhutto.
Well, interestingly, I mentioned this in the book, that I sat sketching the judges, and my editor in the United Kingdom said, "Well, have you still got the sketches?" And again, being the journalist that one was, after 40 years, I got out these. I would say they're very amateur sketches. I'm not saying they're particularly good, but as I realized, and as I say, again, no mobile phones, nobody able to get a quick photograph of Mr. Bhutto as he left the Supreme Court, none of that. So it is true that probably this is the last visual image of Mr. Bhutto, which I think you can see there. Which was the side.
Yes, I can see that.
Which I think it bears some similarity, but it was literally the last, because he was then, after that, he appeared in the Supreme Court in December 1978, and then nobody saw him again apart from his lawyers and immediate members of the family, and of course the prison guards, for the next 4 months, 3 months really.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's interesting that the Supreme Court delivered a judgment 4-3. For upholding the High Court decision. And later, when they went in for an appeal against that decision, all 7 judges turned out and rejected it. What's the story behind that? You say that Safdar Shah met you in London many years later and told you what had happened.
Yes, well, Safdar Shah was one of the judges who upheld the appeal. There were 3, Durrab Patel, Safdar Shah, and Muhammad Halim. And he told me that they had been promised. He didn't actually ever say who promised, but through one of the other judges, the General Zia had promised that if they all rejected the review petition, as it was to review the judgment, that clemency would be shown. And this was the story behind that. And so, in order really to maintain, I think, the integrity of the judiciary, they were persuaded that if they all rejected the review petition, that's what would happen. But as we know now, that did not happen. And so essentially, that's why I think Safdar Shah, he was very disappointed at the end of his life. He came over here because he felt safer in the UK. And I think he was a very disappointed man, as indeed I also spoke to Durrab Patel, who confirmed this to me. But of course, at the time, the justices weren't supposed to speak to journalists, and we had no contact. But it was only subsequent that I was able to meet the 2 of them. I never met Justice Halim, but I did meet Durrab Patel and Justice Safdar Shah. And they said that. I think it was, again, I was not a lawyer. And I think this is one of the facts. I was a historian by training in terms of my degree. And so I didn't understand law, but one thing I did find very strange, and to this day I would say it very strange, that the judgment, the death penalty, could be carried out so swiftly as it was on a split verdict, 4-3. And that's quite extraordinary. There were so many grounds on which clemency could have been shown. And I don't know. It's difficult to say whether with today's media, the way things operate in the media, it would have been different. Generals, they would have been forced to have done something different. There were numerous clemency appeals. These were all ignored. So it's not as though the entire world wasn't asking for clemency. There were debates, there were seminars. And I have to say, I think it's in many respects charted the course of Pakistan's history. And I think you've taken a long time to recover from this, what I saw as a fissure in society, was those who were opposing what happened to Zulfikar Bhutto, and those who thought, well, that's too bad. He's been found guilty, so to speak. But again, we have to refresh our memories. He was not put on trial for murder. He was put on trial for conspiracy to murder. And again, to uphold a death penalty for conspiracy to murder is to me, as I say, as a layperson, I'm not a lawyer, but it was very, very unusual. As I say, it's one of those things that obviously it projected Pakistan into the course that it's followed, because Benazir, herself became very involved in politics. And I think it was in actually the summer of 2007, I said, Benazir, you realize you've been involved in politics longer than your father now. I also pointed out that we were both older than her parents were at that time, because when Zulfikar Bhutto was executed, he was only 51, which at the time, I hate to say this, seemed, that it was quite old. But, when you pass 50s yourself, you then begin to sort of see things in a different perspective. But it's true, she became involved, she was active politically, in fact, for longer than Zulfikar Bhutto was, but she only survived 3 more years longer than he did.
During the review petition, or the appeal in the review petition, you were typing out one of the lawyers, Ghulam Ali Memon's supposed statement when he suddenly had a heart attack and collapsed. I mean, that must have been a very traumatic moment for everybody at that stage.
It was hugely traumatic. And again, it's all back in the past and people have totally forgotten about it. But it was one of those occasions when, well, life can be very tough in so many environments. And this was, everybody was fighting for the former prime minister's life to be saved, and last ditch efforts and documentation and all the rest of it. And everybody was very tired. And then Ghulam Ali Memon, I got to know him quite well. And all these lawyers, they've been working round the clock. And I think, when Benazir heard about it, she said, oh, he hadn't hardly seen his family for the whole year, because they were actually from Karachi, but they were, the appeal was being held in the Supreme Court in Rawalpindi before the current Supreme Court was built in Islamabad. And it was just one of those absolutely tragic situations. He was obviously overworked. And I had been asked to come again just to type this out. And I'd actually, as I say, on a personal level, I'd never seen anybody die before. And I didn't actually know that he was dying, but he was dictating. And then suddenly, I've written it in the book, I've described it exactly as it happened. There was this awful sound. And he literally collapsed of this massive heart attack. And so suddenly, the narrative that you think is going to happen and unfurl completely changes direction, because of course the court has to adjourn, there has to be a funeral. And I remember just one of these particular poignant moments of it was that the lawyers were going down to Karachi, and I found myself ordering plane tickets for lawyers and a coffin. I mean, it was just appalling. And because he knew the sort of intricacies so very well of what the trial and the appeal involved. Again, I'll never forget the sight of Yahya Bakhtiar, who was the chief defense, standing there, and he was just sort of so unnerved, and he said, I feel like an airplane that's lost its engine, and I'm about to fall down. I relied so heavily upon him. I still have that vision in my mind. And so you can imagine what a shock horror this was. This was beginning of March. Well, by the beginning of April, Zulfikar Bhutto had been hanged.
And with the next hearing, the judges condoled for half a minute and then got on with the job.
And moved on. Life has to go on. Yeah, I mean, it was brutal. I mean, Benazir was often used to say fact is stranger than fiction. It's, if you unfurl this in your mind, it's, you'd create a film like this. You couldn't have more drama if you tried to invent it in fiction than that took place during those months. And of course, for me, they were they were very formative in terms of my relationship with Pakistan, which I have to say I love as a country. And through Benazir, I knew nobody when I arrived there. As I say, I was clueless, but I've made so many friends, and I myself feel very comfortable in Pakistan. You might think it's strange to feel comfortable in a place where, I saw such tragedy, but it was through Benazir. She gave me this warmth and affection living in her country. She always kept me not sort of as Angrezi, foreigner that has to sort of be treated differently. She brought me within, and she gave me huge understanding, which, as you said in your opening remarks, fashioned my own career as a journalist and as a writer. I hesitate to say I became a lot less clueless. I became rather better and moved on from the typewriter. And I have made, the study of South Asia my life's work. And perhaps just for those of you who don't know why I came to write on Lord Wavell, it was because I'd written on Kashmir. I wanted to write on Kashmir because I felt this very strongly was a subject which you could be very knowledgeable about in Pakistan and you could be very knowledgeable about in India. And I wanted to somehow combine that knowledge to get more knowledgeable than almost the sort of, in a way, sometimes selective knowledge that both countries had. They had their opinion, but not necessarily the other opinion, and to bring to the forefront the voice of the Kashmiri people, that I began to work on Kashmir in the early 90s during the insurgency. And having written my first book, Kashmir in the Crossfire, I then so much often came back to, you British, you left it, your fault, unfinished business of partition, that I thought I would work on partition. But instead of writing a sort of rather boring study, perhaps, of partition, I wanted to write on one of the key individuals. And to me, one of the key individuals was actually Field Marshal Earl Wavell, because he had been viceroy from 1943 to 47. And, so many people focus on what Mountbatten did, but the groundwork for real students of history to understand what happened at partition, and it's not by watching the film The Viceroy's House, it's by going through all the volumes of the Transfer of Power and all the other information which is available, really lay in Wavell. And it's really interesting. And because, as I mentioned, I had a service background, my father was in the Royal Navy, I wasn't perhaps as daunted as you might think about writing a biography of a military man, which I inevitably had to do. But that's really why I wrote on Lord Wavell. And I often say subjects choose you, you don't necessarily choose them. And so the trajectory of my writing career has been very much focused on South Asia. But, you have to expand sometimes beyond that in order to write on what you want. And so that's really why I wrote on Lord Wavell. And it remains, I'm very glad I've done so, because I understand a lot more now as to what happened. I mean, one might not condone what happened, but to have the understanding at least is a step in the right direction, I believe.
The morning when he was executed, that whole night I couldn't sleep. And of course, we had no internet or anything like that. So I set the alarm for 6 a.m. in the morning to hear the radio. And at 6 a.m., I put the radio on and heard the news that he'd been executed. And I immediately got into my car and went all around Lahore. Then there was an eerie silence. And nobody had come out. Everybody was indoors. It was frightening and shocking also. You write in your book that in Rawalpindi, the scene was different. You suggest that a lot of People's Party activists and others were on the streets, and they were agitating and they were upset and angry. Nothing of the sort happened in Lahore on that particular morning. But then, most interestingly, you make a reference to two of Mr. Bhutto's lieutenants, Mumtaz Bhutto and Hafiz Pirzada. You say they were there to begin with, and then they disappeared while people were still agitating. And you say that some journalists found them having a discreet lunch in some hotel. You leave it at that, but clearly I notice your disapproval of these two gentlemen.
Well, as I say, I was repeating a story that was given to me, on solid source material. I think the thing was that what we were witnessing was the long arm of the military dictatorship. And was what you witnessed also in Lahore. People were scared. And so while people did come out on the streets, they then got scared. And I think in terms of, the party activists, and as I say, the story that they were there to show support, but then, they went. And then the movement sort of dissipated. It requires the leadership for a movement. But once the police and the military moved in, people were scared. They were picked up. Again, I think, going back, writing the memoir, and this applies throughout the 1980s and the terrible time Benazir had. I've called it, I think, living but not living, when she was under arrest, and then her street fighting years when she was out on the streets protesting. It requires tremendous courage when you've got a military dictatorship, because you are risking your life, you're risking, your family's life. And I think for people in Pakistan, we are so long ago, we're a generation ago. Even when General Musharraf took over in the early 2000s, Pakistan, it was under military rule, but it was not under military dictatorship. And the military dictatorship was a very, very difficult time for Pakistan. The West's viewpoint was totally clouded by what was going on in Afghanistan, with following the invasion of the Soviet Union in December 1979. And this, I always feel, gave General Zia an extra lease of life, sort of get out of jail card, because scrutiny for what was going on domestically in Pakistan was sort of lifted, because Pakistan became, as you all well know, that frontline state in the war, the jihad against the Soviet Union. And a blind eye was really turned on, human rights activities and democracy, and the democratic parliamentary democracy. As you know, General Zia managed to stay for 11 years, having promised Operation Fair Play that he would hold elections within 90 days. So, I think, as I say, again, what we know now, we have to sort of forget about and look at it from the perspective of where Pakistan was at that moment in time. And it was a frightening time.
Yeah, it was a frightening time. But, a couple of more questions, because we're running out of time. This is fascinating. I could go on and on. There's so much in your book. I urge everybody to pick up a copy and read it. You say that in 2002, you had a very brief meeting with General Musharraf. And he asked General Rashid Qureshi, his spokesman, to leave the room. And then he turned to you and he said, "You're a friend of Benazir's?" And you said, "Yes." And he said to you, "Will you tell her not to return to Pakistan for the elections that were scheduled in 2002? And you said, "What did you say? And what happened after that?"
Well, I was slightly, I'd actually gone, we should put this in context, Najam, that I'd gone to see him for what was called an exchange of views, because I was going into the Valley of Kashmir. I was actually in Pakistan. And 2002, if you remember, was a very, very difficult time in Pakistan, because the border was shut after the bombing of the Delhi Parliament in December 2001. And I was working actually on a revision of an update of my Kashmir book, which I wanted to do to sort of take into account events post 2001 and 9/11, etc. And he was quite intrigued that I was going in to the Valley of Kashmir, because a lot of people report on Kashmir, but they don't manage to get into the valley. But I was intending to go, and I was actually having to cross Wagah. And so we'd already talked about Kashmir, and that was the formal part. And so it did take me rather by surprise when he sent out General Rashid Qureshi and told me to turn off my tape recorder. And that's when he posed the question, would I, I was a friend of her. And I replied, it's well known. I've never made any secret of my friendship. I work as a journalist, but it's well known. I was taken aback. I thought, well, actually, I'm totally the wrong person as a friend to ask. But I subsequently heard that he asked a lot of people, including the well-known journalist Christina Lamb, to put pressure on Benazir. He didn't want her to come back to contest those elections. And I said, as a friend, I have absolutely no interference at all in Pakistan's politics, and would not dare to interfere with the decisions she takes. And then we left it at that. I must admit, as I think I put in the book, he did look a bit crestfallen, and then we moved
but
on.
Talking of Kashmir and General Musharraf, Benazir once said that Musharraf had also shown her the plans for a Kargil type of an operation, and she told him to forget it, nothing doing. But you mentioned the General Aslam Beg also told her that he was ready to give her 100,000 die-hard mujahideen to liberate Srinagar. And she also put him down and said, we are not going to get into a situation of war. So, I mean, this business of liberating Kashmir has been on a particular agenda, and Benazir put it down twice, and rightly so, because we saw what happened in Kargil, and we saw the consequences of that. So, proving Benazir absolutely right.
Yeah, well, I mean, her response was, well, what next? I mean, and it was absolutely true. This is information. Unfortunately, she had died by the time, so I wasn't able to go over it again with her. But I've taken it from her autobiography, and from conversations I'd had with her, because she told me, and it was during that period she was spending time in London, and she was absolutely horrified at what was going on, because, I mean, her two things were, firstly, the sort of, dare I say it, subterfuge that these were all mujahideen. And I was working on again, another revision of the book, and I was getting these press statements saying they were all mujahideen, and one knows full well the terrain of Pakistan and the Gilgit terrain, that you're not going to be able to go up there in, as one of my military friends said, in a shorts and a singlet. You need proper training to go across. And what upset her was that it was Pakistan's Northern Light Infantry soldiers, and they were not being owned, so to speak, that they had, those who died, they were sort of, and that upset her. She felt that we must recognize that these are Pakistan soldiers who've given their life for this operation. But apart from that, she again saw that the foolhardiness of it was not going to achieve any particular objectives. And here I must say that I think the book that was written by Nasim Zehra, which took her 17 years to write, is a very courageous book, because she charts this exactly, what happened. And I'm afraid to say that I do believe that this operation set back Indo-Pakistani relations for some considerable time. I don't think really that they have recovered to the extent. I mean, yes, you had the attempt at Agra, you had the peace process that Musharraf himself initiated, but the trust element had gone. And again, if you go back to the sort of primary sources of what was going on at that time with Nawaz Sharif and the peace process, and Prime Minister Vajpayee coming and speaking from the Minar-e-Pakistan, and meanwhile you've got a military operation going on. And it's very telling. And I think, we are at a situation now, Pakistan's relationship with India is not what I would call flourishing. What I've seen from observing the relationship is that you have these flashes of time, you have these moments of opportunity, which, it's like the tectonic plates. And if it's not seized, it's gone. And I actually think, having written my memoir and gone back on her meetings with Rajiv Gandhi, I think you had that opportunity in 88, 89. They had those two meetings quite swiftly, one upon the other, the end in December 88, and then when he came again in the summer of 89. And who knows how history could have been different. She herself said history could have been different if I hadn't been dismissed as she was in August 90. And then Rajiv lost the election. And then, of course, he was assassinated. So no chance of coming back again. And this is where, putting my sort of more historical analysis hat on, for the benefit of South Asia, an area I really love. These opportunities have to be seized, because then you've moved away. And right now you've moved away. And what's going on?
It was time for her to come back to Pakistan, and Musharraf had to make way for her. And you write that the British and American governments made that possible. Although I remember Benazir telling me that she'd asked General Musharraf for security and he'd refused. She'd asked the American vice president to lean on him and he'd refused, and so on. When she came back, you flew with her from Dubai to Karachi. And then, of course, you were in that fated truck.
Yeah.
And you were part of that whole calamity, that crisis, that accident, that gruesome situation. And you guys survived, and 150 people were dead. Benazir used to say, I remember, I think you mentioned this in your book too, that I think it was in September of 1979, I think, that some army commandos barged or burst into her rooms in Larkana with automatic weapons. She was in uh, house arrest and or something like that. And she said that she was scarred psychologically by that terrifying incident. And then, of course, this thing happens. And I remember meeting her after that in Islamabad, and where she described the whole thing to me. And she was very sanguine and calm when she described it all to me. But you were there. How did you feel? What were your thoughts when it happened? You were there with a number of other people in that truck.
Well, I mean, to me, Najam, it was the beginning of the end. I know this is a slightly cliched statement, but it was the beginning of the end. I think, as you know, what we're looking at, and we've done this rapid run through from the 70s through to the 2007. She had grown and she'd changed, and she'd become, as I say, the characteristics were always there, that fantastic resilience that she had, that she could pick herself up and get going again. And I think, the year that we've talked a lot about, the 78, 79 year, it prepared her in a way for everything. It was a very low year. You couldn't almost go lower than that. And she then picked herself up and got on and led her life and got married and had her children. And so by the time we get to, Benazir in her 50s, she's mature. She's suffered a lot. She's lost both her brothers violently, having also lost her father, and her mother by that stage is unwell. And so she'd got an inner strength, which I saw, and I suppose because I'd seen her consistently, some people saw her, didn't see her, then, noticed maybe, but I'd seen her grow in that strength. And so by the time she went back, she was actually prepared to face anything and everything. And it was, for me, I kind of, as I say, it was like this ghastly window opened that I suddenly looked into the crystal ball. And, there'd been, as we know, Pakistan had been a very turbulent place. There'd been so many assassinations, bombings, suicide killings, etc. And I did have this terrible fear that, the worst could happen, where I'd always sort of hoped that it wouldn't happen. And as I say, it's not to rate at all. There's 150 people who did die on that first attack. We were incredibly fortunate, but as I say, it was one of the largest killings at that time, I think, in Pakistan's history, and it was absolutely terrible for those who did die. But I think, and it all brings us really towards the end of the story, that I stayed in Pakistan for a week, but I had to get back, and I did worry. I felt I would never see her again. I just somehow, that awful crystal ball I looked into, I just thought that, she may not get through this. But then I got back and, distance gave me, oh, well, maybe she'll be okay. She'll get through. I distanced myself. But for that flash of that time, I suddenly did think, well, this really is, the kid gloves in a way are off. This is just very, very dangerous. And the course she's pursuing is very, very dangerous. And there are people out there who hate her and will want to get rid of her. And as I say, I hate to say it, I was right in my prediction. I never did see her again after I left Pakistan in October 2007, and then that terrible news of her assassination in December. But politics is very dangerous. And I suppose, I shouldn't be surprised, because I saw it in 78, 79. I saw the lengths that people would go to. And, it is a very risky business. And that's why I think, overall, one has to commend Benazir, because her sense of duty, that vision, however she managed it in the 21st century, was instilled into her, that she went back. She could have just said, too tough. I'm not going to do this. I could become Secretary General of the United Nations, or I could become any other figure. And actually, I think she would have had a fantastic role to play in one of those international roles. She had such charisma. Heads, as I've often said, did proverbially turn when she entered the room. She did have an extraordinary presence.
I think she did express a particular sentiment that you and she perhaps might end up as presidents of two Oxford colleges. Yes.
Wonderful. I, it was a little throwaway comment. We were sitting having lunch with our
Yeah.
principal at Lady Margaret Hall, and she thought, oh, this is a nice little, for her. Um, she has her detractors. She has.
You're standing in front of a clerk at the Oxford Union Society along with Bilawal, and you're trying to get him registered. And Bilawal has not got all his information in order, and Benazir is with him, and you're with him. And this is Christchurch, and then this is the Union, and the lady asks for an identification, and Bilawal hasn't got it, and Benazir turns to her and says, well, you've got two past presidents of the Oxford Union in front of you. What more authentication do you require? So Bilawal Bhutto joins Oxford and the Oxford Union, and today is a prime candidate to take Benazir's place. How history has moved on.
How history has.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Honestly, I could talk to you for hours. I have so many stories to tell about Benazir, her generosity, her kindness. She was an incredible woman. And as you say, the last trip before she passed away, there was a maturity to her that I had not seen in the earlier occasions. I mean, in the mid 2000s, when she was in self-exile, Jugnu and I went to see her in her flat in London. And some elections were about to take place, and there was a horde of people outside lining up to get tickets and so on. And she called the two of us in, and they were all standing outside. And I remember the conversation. Bilawal and the other kids were running around. And she told them to get out because Uncle Najam was there and Auntie Jugnu was there. And she said, I don't think I've had enough of this. And I think I should be president or maybe chairman of the Senate and let somebody else run this country. So she was, in that sort of a mood at that time. This is the mid 2000s, I think 2005. Yeah. And then, of course, everything began to change. And I remember, I think it's 2007 when all this talk of her coming back and to sweep. And you have a destiny, you have to fulfill that destiny. And Asif took the phone from her and said, no, her life will be in danger. I remember that distinctly. I'm recalling this because after her demise, I went to Karachi to condole with Asif. And he showed me that will. And it is her handwriting, unmistakable, because I have samples of her handwriting. She's written some things on her photographs which she sent us. And as you say in your book too, that was her handwriting. She was an incredible woman. She touched our lives in so many ways. I think on that note, before I get more emotional.
I think we were very privileged, those of us who've known her. And I do agree, it was her destiny. And ironically, her autobiography is called Daughter of Destiny. It was her destiny to go back. I think she did want to contribute. I think the dismissals of her two first administrations rankled. She wanted to feel she'd got, as I say, she said it to me too. She wanted a legacy, and then she wanted to quit. She wanted to lead a life with her children and her family.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. And as I said, we can carry on talking. Maybe we'll have another opportunity. But let people read your book. I understand it's going to be out tomorrow. And in the meanwhile, take care, look after yourself. I hear London is not a terribly good place to be in at the moment, nor is Pakistan, I can tell you. But inshallah, we shall meet.
Inshallah.
And until then, fond memories of Benazir Bhutto.
Thank you, Khadafis. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.